Have you ever wondered why two people can start with the same opportunities, work equally hard, and yet end up living completely different lives? Is success really about talent, luck, intelligence? Or is there something deeper, something hidden in the way we think? Welcome to Code Your English, the channel where we don't just learn English. We transform the way we think, communicate, and grow. Here, every episode helps you improve your English while discovering life-changing ideas from the world's greatest books and thinkers. Today's journey is one of the most influential ever written. Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill is much more than a book about money. It's a book about mindset, purpose, persistence, and unlocking the extraordinary potential already inside you. For nearly a century, its ideas have inspired entrepreneurs, leaders, athletes, and millions of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results. But today, we're doing something different. We're not just going to read this book, we're going to experience it together. You'll improve your English listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and at the same time, discover powerful lessons that can change the way you approach your career, your goals, your confidence, and even your journey toward English fluency. So, whether you're listening while driving, walking, studying, or relaxing at home, take a moment to focus, because one idea from today's episode could completely change the direction of your future. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Code Your English and join thousands of learners from around the world who are building better English and a better life, one episode at a time. Now, get comfortable, open your mind, and let's begin our journey into one of the most powerful books ever written. Think and Grow Rich: The Idea That Refuses to Die. Somewhere in a small apartment in Ohio, in the middle of the night, a 9-year-old boy was crying next to a radio. His father had just died. The family had no money, no plan, and no one to explain why terrible things happened to people who did nothing wrong. That boy's name was Napoleon Hill, and 40 years later, he would write one of the most read books in human history, a book that has quietly changed the financial life of more people than almost any single piece of writing ever created. Today, we are going to open that book together, page by page, idea by idea, and by the end of this episode, something in the way you think about money, effort, and your own mind is going to shift. Stay with me, because the next 30 minutes might be more valuable than anything you have listened to this month. By the end of this episode, you will understand the 13 principles that Napoleon Hill discovered after studying more than 500 of the most successful people of his time, people like Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford. You will know exactly why some people turn ordinary ideas into extraordinary results, while other people, who are just as smart and just as hardworking, stay stuck for their entire lives. And more importantly, you will learn how to use these same principles, not just to build wealth, but to build fluency in English. Because the mind that creates financial success and the mind that creates language success are, surprisingly, the very same mind. Let's be honest with each other for a second. Many of you listening right now have a dream that feels far away. Maybe it's speaking English so naturally that people forget it isn't your first language. Maybe it's a better job, a better life, a level of confidence you have never quite reached. And somewhere along the way, a quiet voice inside your head has told you that you're not talented enough, not lucky enough, not born into the right family. I want you to know something before we go any further. That voice is lying to you, and Napoleon Hill spent 25 years of his life proving exactly that. I remember the first time I read this book myself, years ago, sitting in a small room, feeling exactly the kind of stuck that so many of you describe to me in your messages every week. I was skeptical, honestly. A book with the word rich in the title, written almost 90 years ago, promising to change how you think. It sounded like something a salesman would say. But somewhere around the third chapter, I realized this wasn't a book about money at all. Not really. It was a book about the mechanics of the human mind, about why certain thoughts, repeated with enough intensity and emotion, eventually reshape the actions we take every single day. And once I understood that, I couldn't unsee it, in business, in relationships, and yes, in something as specific as learning a new language. The story behind the book. Let's rewind to the year 1908. A young journalist named Napoleon Hill was sent to interview one of the richest men in the world, the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. What was supposed to be a 3-hour interview turned into 3 days, because Carnegie said something that changed the course of Hill's entire life. Carnegie believed that success followed a definite formula, a set of principles that could be learned by anyone, rich or poor, educated or not. He challenged young Hill to spend the next 20 years of his life interviewing successful men and women, without payment, just letters of introduction, and to organize what he learned into a philosophy that ordinary people could actually use. Hill accepted the challenge. Over the following 2 decades, he interviewed more than 500 people, including Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, and many others who had built extraordinary lives from nothing. He also studied hundreds of people who had failed, because failure, Hill believed, teaches us just as much as success does, sometimes more. Hill himself failed multiple times during those 20 years. He lost businesses, he lost money, and at one point he was almost completely broke, teaching the very principles of success, while struggling to apply them fully to his own life. I find this detail strangely comforting, honestly. The man who wrote the definitive book on achievement was, for a long stretch of his own life, still learning to walk the path he was describing to others. That's not a contradiction. That's exactly how mastery actually works. For him, and for every one of you learning English right now. In 1937, in the middle of the Great Depression, when millions of people had lost everything, banks had collapsed, and entire families were standing in bread lines, Hill published Think and Grow Rich. The timing was almost poetic. At the exact moment when the world felt most hopeless, when it seemed like external circumstances controlled everything, Hill offered a message that felt almost rebellious. Your outer world is shaped by your inner world, and you have far more control over your circumstances than you have ever been taught to believe. The book sold slowly at first, spread mostly by word of mouth, but over the following decades, it became one of the best-selling books of all time, with estimates suggesting more than 100 million copies sold worldwide. Presidents have quoted it. Athletes have credited it. Entrepreneurs from every corner of the globe point to this single book as the moment their thinking changed. Principle 1. Desire. the starting point of all achievement. Let's talk about the first, and in many ways, the most important principle in the entire book: desire. Not a wish, not a hope, not a maybe someday I'll learn English fluently. Hill makes a sharp distinction between a wish and what he calls a burning desire, a desire so strong and so specific that it becomes almost an obsession. Here's a story that captures this perfectly. There was a boy named Edwin Barnes who had one desire in his life: to become a business partner of Thomas Edison. He had no money, no education, no connections. He didn't even have enough money for a proper train ticket to reach Edison's laboratory in New Jersey. He arrived on a freight train, dressed like someone who had nowhere else to sleep. When Edison saw him standing at the door, he didn't see a homeless traveler. Edison later said that in that man's eyes was the look of someone who had made up his mind, someone who intended to stand there until he got what he came for. Barnes wasn't hired that day, but he was given a job sweeping floors. He didn't complain. He watched. He learned. He waited for the right opportunity. Years later, when Edison invented the dictating machine, none of his salesmen believed it would sell. Barnes did. And because he had positioned himself close to Edison for years, he became the exclusive distributor of that machine across the entire United States, eventually becoming Edison's actual business partner, exactly as he had imagined years before. Now let's pause here, because I want you to notice something. Elif, one of our regular students in this podcast, once told me something very similar. She said, "I want to speak English better." And I asked her, "How much better? By when? For what purpose?" She didn't have an answer. That's a wish, not a desire. A few weeks later, she came back and said something completely different. "I want to give a 10-minute presentation in English, in front of my entire company, in 4 months, without reading from notes." That is a burning desire. It has a shape, it has a deadline, it has a reason behind it. Hill would say that Elif's second sentence contains more power than 1,000 vague wishes. Hill actually breaks the process of turning desire into reality into 6 very specific, almost mechanical steps. Fix in your mind the exact amount or outcome you want. Decide exactly what you intend to give in return for it. Establish a definite date by which you intend to possess it. Create a definite plan, and begin immediately. Whether you're ready or not, write out a clear, concise statement of everything above. And finally, read this written statement aloud twice daily, seeing and feeling and believing yourself already in possession of it. Notice how physical and practical this process is. Hill wasn't asking people to simply hope harder. He was asking them to engage in a repeated, disciplined ritual, almost like training a muscle every single day until the belief became automatic. Pause for a moment and repeat this sentence out loud. I have a burning desire to... Now finish that sentence with something specific about your English. Something with a shape and a deadline. Say it slowly, 3 times. Principle 2. Faith. Visualizing and believing in achievement. The second principle is faith, and I want to be clear here because this word confuses a lot of people. Hill is not talking about religious faith, although religion certainly connects to it. He's talking about a state of mind that can be developed through repetition, through consistently feeding your mind with thoughts of confidence rather than thoughts of fear. Hill believed that whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve, and he wasn't being poetic. He genuinely meant this as a practical formula. Think about Henry Ford for a moment. When Ford wanted to build the V8 engine with all 8 cylinders cast in one block, his own engineers told him it was physically impossible. Nobody had ever done it. Ford didn't argue with the science. He simply said, "Produce it anyway." His engineers worked for months, hit dead ends, came back and told him again that it couldn't be done. Ford's answer never changed. "Keep going. I want it, and I will have it." Eventually, almost by accident, one of the engineers found a solution. The impossible became standard. What's fascinating is that Ford wasn't an engineer himself. His faith wasn't based on technical knowledge. It was based on a decision he had made in his mind long before the evidence existed. This connects directly to language learning in a way that I think will surprise you. Thomas, another student many of you know from our earlier episodes, once told me he was terrified of making mistakes in English meetings. His faith in his own ability was almost zero, even though his grammar was actually quite strong. The problem wasn't his English. The problem was what he believed about his English. Once he began repeating to himself every single morning, "I am becoming someone who speaks clearly and calmly under pressure," something shifted. Not overnight, not magically, but gradually, his nervous system stopped treating English meetings as danger and started treating them as normal. That is faith, built through repetition, exactly the way Hill described it almost 90 years ago. Hill also makes a fascinating point here, one that connects faith directly back to autosuggestion, which we'll get to in a moment. He argues that faith is not something you're simply born with or without. It's a state of mind that can be deliberately induced through the repetition of instructions to your subconscious mind, through what he calls a process of self-suggestion. In other words, faith is trainable, the same way a muscle is trainable, the same way vocabulary is trainable. You don't wait to feel confident before you speak English. You speak English, imperfectly at first, and the confidence arrives gradually, built by the repeated evidence that you survived the conversation and nothing terrible happened. Principle 3. Autosuggestion, the medium for influencing the subconscious mind. This brings us naturally to the third principle, autosuggestion, which is really the engine that makes faith possible. Autosuggestion is the process of deliberately, consciously feeding your subconscious mind with specific instructions, usually through repeated, emotionally charged statements. Hill actually recommends writing down your definite desire, reading it aloud twice a day, once in the morning and once before sleep, and reading it with feeling, not just mechanically. Here's why this matters so much, and here's where the science actually catches up with Hill's century-old idea. Your subconscious mind doesn't distinguish very well between something you vividly imagine and something that actually happened. Athletes have used this for decades. A basketball player who mentally rehearses free throws activates many of the same neural pathways as a player who physically practices them. Hill was essentially describing mental rehearsal long before neuroscience had the tools to explain why it works. Let's practice this right now, together. I want you to say this sentence out loud, with real feeling, not just reading it. Every day, in every conversation, I am becoming a more confident English speaker. Say it once quietly. Now say it again, but this time Say it like you actually believe it. Principle 4. Specialized knowledge. Personal experiences or observations. The fourth principle often surprises people because Hill makes a claim that sounds almost backwards at first. General knowledge, no matter how vast, does very little to attract money or success. What matters is specialized knowledge, organized and directed toward a specific goal. He tells the story of Henry Ford being mocked in court during a lawsuit, when a lawyer tried to prove Ford was ignorant by asking him basic historical trivia questions. Ford, visibly annoyed, pointed to a row of buttons on his desk and said that he could summon any expert he needed within minutes to answer any such question. So why should he waste his own brain storing information he could access instantly through other people? This is such a liberating idea for English learners, honestly. So many of you believe you need to know everything about English grammar, every rule, every exception, before you're allowed to speak. But that's general knowledge, scattered and unfocused. What you actually need is specialized knowledge directed at your specific goal. If your goal is workplace communication, you don't need to master literary English or Shakespearean vocabulary. You need the specific words, the specific phrases, and the specific confidence required for meetings, emails, and presentations. Specialized, not general. Focused, not scattered. Hill also makes an important distinction here that I think gets overlooked. Knowledge itself, he writes, is not power. Knowledge is only potential power. It becomes actual power only when it is organized into definite plans of action and directed toward a definite end. This is precisely why some people can study English grammar for 10 years and still freeze in a real conversation, while other people with far less formal study speak with confidence and ease. The first group accumulated knowledge without organizing it toward action. The second group, often without even realizing it, applied Hill's principle instinctively, taking whatever specialized knowledge they had and immediately putting it to work in real situations. Principle 5. Imagination. The workshop of the mind. Hill divides imagination into two types: synthetic imagination, which combines old ideas and concepts into new arrangements, and creative imagination, which is where genuinely new ideas seem to arrive, almost like flashes of insight. Most successful business ideas, Hill argues, come from synthetic imagination, taking something that already exists and rearranging it in a way nobody had thought of before. There's a wonderful example involving a young pharmacy clerk who wanted to create a new drink. He didn't invent anything chemically new. He simply combined existing ingredients in a new formula and sold the rights for a very small amount of money because he lacked imagination about its future value. The people who bought those rights turned it into one of the most recognized brands on the planet, Coca-Cola. The ingredients weren't new. The imagination applied to marketing, branding, and distribution was. Here's a small challenge for your imagination right now. Elif, our student, once combined two things nobody had put together before in her own learning routine. She took her love of cooking and her need to practice English, and she started narrating her cooking process out loud in English every evening while making dinner. Nothing revolutionary in the ingredients, everything revolutionary in the combination. That's synthetic imagination, applied to something as ordinary as making pasta. Take 10 seconds right now and think of one activity you already enjoy in your first language. Now, imagine combining it with English practice, the way Elif did. Don't judge the idea yet. Just let your imagination play with it. Principle 6. Organized planning. The crystallization of desire into action. A desire without a plan is just a daydream, and Hill is very direct about this. He insists that you must create a definite, practical plan for achieving your desire. And if your first plan fails, which it very often will, you must simply create another plan, and another, until you find one that works. He tells the story of hundreds of people who quit exactly one step before success, not realizing how close they actually were because they treated a failed plan as a failed dream, when really it was only a failed attempt. This idea alone could save so many English learners from giving up. So many of you have tried one method, maybe an app, maybe a textbook, maybe a course, and when it didn't produce fluency fast enough, you concluded that you're simply not good at languages. But Hill would say something very different. Your desire was never the problem. Your plan was the problem. And a failed plan is information, not a verdict on your ability. Principle 7. Decision. The mastery of procrastination. Here's a statistic from Hill's research that genuinely surprised me the first time I read it. He analyzed the habits of people who accumulated great wealth and found that almost every single one of them made decisions quickly and changed those decisions slowly, if ever. Meanwhile, people who failed to accumulate wealth typically made decisions slowly, if at all, and changed them frequently and quickly, often based on the opinions of others. Think about how often we do the opposite in language learning. We take forever to decide to start speaking practice, and the moment one person criticizes our accent or corrects our grammar in public, we instantly decide to stop and retreat into silence. Hill would say we have this exactly backwards. Decide quickly to begin. Once you've decided, protect that decision fiercely from the casual opinions of people who haven't walked your path. Right now, make one small, fast decision. Decide on one specific day and time this week when you will speak English out loud for 10 minutes, even if it's just to yourself. Say the day and time out loud, right now, before you keep listening. Principle 8. Persistence, the sustained effort necessary to induce faith. Persistence, Hill writes, is to character what carbon is to steel. Without it, nothing of real strength can be built. And he shares one of my favorite stories in the entire book, about a man named R.U. Darby, who was mining for gold with his uncle. They struck a rich vein, borrowed money for equipment, and were on the edge of enormous wealth, when suddenly the vein of gold disappeared. They dug and found nothing more. Discouraged, they sold all their equipment to a junk dealer for almost nothing and went home. The junk dealer, however, was smarter, or perhaps just more persistent. He called in a mining engineer who calculated that the vein had simply shifted, faulted, as geologists say, and that it very likely continued just 3 feet from where Darby and his uncle had stopped digging. The junk dealer resumed digging in that exact spot and found one of the richest gold deposits in that entire region, worth millions. Darby never forgot this lesson. He later became a successful insurance salesman, and whenever a customer said no, he would remind himself, "I may be only 3 feet from gold." That single memory, Hill writes, made Darby wealthy for the rest of his career. I think about Thomas here again. He told me once that he almost stopped practicing English after a conversation with a native speaker who seemed impatient with his pace. He felt like giving up completely, exactly the way Darby and his uncle almost gave up on that gold mine. But he didn't quit. He kept going, and just 2 months later, he had his first fully confident, natural conversation in English, one that flowed without him translating in his head at all. He was 3 feet from gold and didn't know it yet. Hill identifies 8 specific factors that build persistence, things like a definite purpose backed by burning desire, self-reliance, definiteness of plans, accurate knowledge, cooperation with others, willpower, and the habit of persistence itself, developed simply through consistent practice, day after day, whether or not you feel motivated on any particular day. He also names the symptoms of a lack of persistence, and reading this list feels almost uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has tried and abandoned a language learning app 3 or 4 times. Failure to recognize and sharply define exactly what you want. Procrastination. Lack of interest in acquiring specialized knowledge. Indecision. The habit of blaming circumstances instead of taking responsibility. Weak desire resulting from the failure to choose a motive powerful enough to drive you forward. And the tendency to quit at the first sign of difficulty rather than pushing through it. If even 1 or 2 of these symptoms sound familiar to you right now, don't feel discouraged. Recognizing the pattern is actually the first step toward breaking it. Principle 9. The power of the mastermind. Hill defines the mastermind as the coordination of knowledge and effort in a spirit of harmony between 2 or more people for the attainment of a definite purpose. No person, he argues, has ever accumulated great fortune or achieved great success without the help of what he calls this mastermind alliance. Andrew Carnegie's fortune was built not by Carnegie alone, but by a coordinated group of specialists, chemists, salesmen, engineers, and managers, all working in harmony toward the same clearly defined goal. For your English journey, this means something very practical. You were never meant to do this entirely alone. Every learner who eventually reaches fluency has some version of a mastermind around them, a teacher, a study partner, a community, or even, dare I say it, a podcast host who shows up every week with new ideas designed specifically to move you forward. That's not an accident. That's Principle 9, alive and working, right here, right now, between you and me. I want you to think about the community listening to this episode right now. All 150,000 of you, spread across dozens of countries, all working towards some version of the same goal. When you comment on this episode, when you share your progress, when you answer another listener's question in our community discussions, you are literally participating in a mastermind alliance, exactly as Hill described it, even though most of you have never met each other in person. Elif has told me that reading other students' comments, seeing that someone in another country struggles with the exact same fear she does, made her feel less alone in this process than almost anything else she's tried. That feeling isn't a small side benefit. According to Hill, it's one of the actual mechanisms of achievement. Principle 10 and 11. The mystery of sex transmutation and the subconscious mind. Hill also writes about the transmutation of energy, the idea that powerful emotional and creative energy can be redirected from one form of expression into focused, driven work, and about the subconscious mind as the connecting link between conscious thought and what he calls infinite intelligence. While some of this language feels dated by today's standards, the underlying psychological insight still holds up remarkably well. Your subconscious mind is always listening, always absorbing whatever thoughts you repeat most often, whether those thoughts are, "I always mess up my English," or "I am becoming fluent, one conversation at a time." The subconscious does not judge the content. It simply reinforces whatever pattern you feed it most consistently. Principle 12. The brain, a broadcasting and receiving station for thought. Hill was fascinated by the idea that the brain functions somewhat like a radio, capable of broadcasting thought and receiving vibrations of thought from other minds. Modern neuroscience wouldn't describe it in exactly these terms, but there's an interesting kernel of truth here about how our mental state influences the people around us. Confidence tends to be somewhat contagious, and so, unfortunately, is anxiety. When Elif walks into an English conversation already broadcasting fear, the people around her often respond with hesitation too, and the conversation becomes stiff. When she walks in broadcasting calm curiosity, people relax around her, and the conversation flows. She isn't reading minds. She's simply demonstrating something Hill described almost a century ago in his own language. Principle 13. The sixth sense, the door to the temple of wisdom. The final principle is what Hill calls the sixth sense, a kind of intuitive wisdom that develops only after the other 12 principles have been mastered and absorbed. He describes it almost like a guardian angel, an inner voice that guides decisions once your mind has been properly trained through practice, faith, and persistence. Whether or not you believe in something mystical here, there's a very grounded, practical version of this idea. Experienced people in any field often develop a kind of pattern recognition, an intuition that looks almost magical to beginners, but is really the product of thousands of hours of focused practice. A fluent English speaker often just knows which word sounds right in a sentence, not because of a rule they consciously remember, but because their mind has absorbed the pattern so deeply it now feels like instinct. The Six Ghosts of Fear. Before Hill closes the book, he warns readers about 6 basic fears that sabotage almost every human being at some point. The fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of loss of love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death. He argues that most of our indecision, our procrastination, and our self-sabotage comes from one or more of these fears operating quietly in the background, often without us even noticing them. For English learners specifically, the fear of criticism is almost always the biggest silent killer of progress. It's the fear that someone will laugh at your accent, correct your grammar in front of others, or judge you as not good enough. Hill's advice here is refreshingly direct. Analyze the fear honestly, understand exactly where it comes from, and realize that most of it exists only in your imagination, rehearsed and repeated so many times that it feels more real than it actually is. It's worth noticing how closely the fear of poverty and the fear of criticism actually work together in real life. Hill observed that the fear of poverty often begins as a fear of what other people will think if you fail financially, and in the exact same way, The fear of making mistakes in English is very rarely about the mistake itself. It's about the imagined face of a stranger judging you silently. But here's something worth sitting with for a moment. That imagined stranger is almost always far less critical, in reality, than the version your mind has created. Most native speakers, when they hear someone attempting their language with real effort, feel something closer to respect than judgment. The fear is real, but the danger it warns you about is almost always exaggerated far beyond the actual risk. Here's your small victory moment for today. Say this sentence out loud, clearly, without apologizing for any mistakes. My accent is proof that I speak more than one language, and that is something to be proud of. Say it again, a little louder this time. Bringing it all together. So here's where all 13 principles come together into one simple truth. Napoleon Hill never actually promised that thinking alone makes you rich. That's the biggest misunderstanding people have about this book's title. What he actually proved through 25 years of research and 500 interviews is that a burning desire, combined with faith, specialized knowledge, imagination, a solid plan, quick decisions, relentless persistence, and the right people around you transforms thought into physical reality, dollar by dollar, word by word, conversation by conversation. Your English fluency is not so different from Hill's definition of riches. You need a burning desire, not a vague wish. You need faith, built through repetition. You need specialized knowledge, focused on your specific goals, not scattered across every grammar rule in existence. You need imagination to combine English practice with things you already love. You need a plan, and when that plan fails, a new plan. You need to decide quickly and protect that decision from casual criticism. You need persistence, because you might be 3 feet from your own breakthrough right now. You need a mastermind around you, people and resources supporting your growth. And eventually, with enough consistent practice, you'll develop your own sixth sense for English, that intuitive feeling when a sentence just sounds right. Your challenge this week. Here is your homework, and I want it to be small enough that you cannot make an excuse to skip it. Write down one specific burning desire related to your English, with a clear deadline. Read it out loud, with feeling, once when you wake up and once before you sleep, exactly as Hill recommended in 1937. Do this every day this week, and notice, just notice, whether your motivation feels any different by Sunday. And here's a question I want you to answer in the comments, and I read every single one of them myself. What is one moment in your life when you almost quit something, but didn't? And it turned out you were closer to success than you realized, just like Darby and his gold mine. I want to hear your story, because your story might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. What's coming next? Next week, we're moving from Napoleon Hill's world of desire and persistence into a completely different but equally powerful book about habits, the tiny 1% improvements that quietly compound into massive transformation over time. If you've ever wondered why small daily English practice beats occasional long study sessions, next week's episode will give you the science and the story behind exactly why that's true. Until then, remember this: your English fluency is not a gift given to lucky people. It's a decision, repeated daily, protected from doubt, and pushed forward with persistence Exactly the same formula that built fortunes, built companies, and built the confident version of you that is already waiting on the other side of consistent practice. I'll see you in the next episode. Keep going. You might be closer than you think.